Good morning to you. My name is Han Gon-Soo, professor from Gangwon University in charge of Department of Cultural Anthropology. So I was asked to deliver a presentation on cultural diversity policy in Korea, current status and challenges. Let me share my screen with you. I opened up the file, but I thought I already shared my screen with you, but I did not. My apology. So I just started to share my screen with you. So the topic I was given is to introduce policies on cultural diversity in Korea. And I looked up the titles of other speakers and I thought I better explain to you about the topic that I chose. So related to the migrants and also immigrants and discussions and policies about them. So that has been accumulated over the years since 2006. So cultural diversity is definitely a topic that I'm going to speak to you about. It could be related to migrants and also it could be related to education on them. And it has been discussed for a long time in Korea. In this context, when we think of concept and also policy on cultural diversity, I think we better first understand about the development of the policies and how the policies have been changed. So I think by doing that, I think I can help you better understand about this concept. So the agenda on cultural diversity has been regarded as the same thing as an educational policy on multicultural policies, not only the government, but also from the academia. There are so many activists involved in multicultural migrants. I think we need to understand why they come up to the fore and calling for cultural diversity. So I think we need to understand about the background of why they are doing that. By doing so, I think we can better understand about this concept and also policy and discussion about the cultural diversity is growing to the next stage to a multicultural diversity. So in Korea, agenda on cultural diversity was officially introduced. I'm not sure whether you remember or not. It was back in 2004 when we were under participatory administration, when the Ministry of Culture was headed by Minister Lee Chang-dong. For the first time, that was when we proposed a policy on cultural diversity from the long-term perspective. That is the vision for the 21st century, the new culture, and it is abbreviated as Creative Korea. That was released back in 2004, and it was published as a book. So it was a new chapter for policy on cultural diversity. And Creative Korea, back then, 200 experts and activists participated in establishing the vision, which is included in Creative Korea. And when I reflect on how we established, I participated in that vision, but I was not given full explanation about what I was doing. The experts who participated in envisioning the vision, we had writing members of the committee, and there were numbers of subcommittees and advisory members who were invited over. Back then, I was working for cultural rights of migrant workers. And back then, yes, it was the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. The name was back then. And I could not understand what kind of long-term vision or goal was headed by the ministry. But I think the discussion we had back then was very important. We need to fundamentally change the foundation of a cultural policy. And there were theorists, for example, the members of the Foundation for Culture, they called for innovation of cultural policy. But when we look into this book or brochure, there was a subcommittee for migrant workers, and there was a committee for multicultural families and also intermarriage people. But the concept about the cultural diversity, when we think of the need for it, what was startled was that it did not really apply for the multicultural members of our society. This creative Korea, this political vision did not really reflect a variety of concepts. So back in 2010 and also 2000s, when we think of the areas of culture, these 5 areas kept mentioned. So back in 2014, when there was act enacted, I was wondering where these 5 areas of cultural diversity came from. So I had to look it up for myself. And I found that it started from Creative Korea, that vision, which were established in 2004. So that book was the very starting point of the areas for cultural diversity. So this long-term, very meaningful vision, I would say it has not been so successful. And maybe I can explain to you in more detail later on. And I think there is a confusion over the concept of cultural diversity. In the preface, in order to innovate the cultural policy, it says that we need to change the cultural concept. And in anthropology, I think the concept of culture in that theory is not appropriate in order to make it as a foundation for our cultural policy. Rather, I think the cultural concept mentioned in UNESCO is more appropriate for our cultural policy. And what is surprising is that cultural concept in UNESCO was not fully understood by the writers for the vision of Creative Korea. It is an inclusive concept going beyond and culture and humanity. That's the premise. However, the concept for the anthropology within the concept for culture in the anthropology is too vague and broad. And when we look at this vision, it has more than 700 pages and 200 advisory members discussed and wrote. And also, I remember we recorded the meeting. And then that was written into text in order to establish this book. It means that by its subordinate committee, there were so many policy suggestions by each committee, and there were many confusions among them. And there was the person called Shim Kwang-hyun, and back then 2008, he mentioned what was a failure within this creative Korea. I think we failed to expand the concept of cultural diversity. That's what he said. Because I think the perspectives of the officials who are in charge of cultural policy found this concept very unfamiliar and very difficult to implement it. And that means that we could not be free from the very solid frame of the existing cultural concept. The problem is that the very core of the policy of cultural diversity, since it was released in 2004, UNESCO, yes, had the Declaration on the Cultural Diversity and Convention on the Cultural Diversity, and Korea ratified it. But discussion on the very basic question was gone in Korea. And because of the two changes in Korea, the first, in 2006, we started to take policy measures on increasing number of migrants. So the discussion on migrants was included in our policy. And the next thing is what I heard from the discussion with the expert. I think one of the reasons was because, of course, FTA. So cultural diversity, that issue started to disappear because of course, FTA. And since then, all the agenda proposed by the policy on cultural diversity was boiled down to multicultural policies, meaning that cultural diversity was understood and narrowed down to problems between Korean society and migrants. There's so many discussions taking place in Korean society around that, and there are problems and limitations among experts. So when we talk about multicultural education, that should be very comprehensive, targeting the general public and the Korean society. But that policy is shrunken to only target migrants and children of migrants, which lead to another problem. Welfare policy targeting migrants or human rights issues targeting migrants, and also the human rights issues for the women of migrants. So there were many discussions in order to raise awareness, but all the discussions boiled down to enlighten the general public, and also we only focused on to include migrants into our society, meaning that we need to recognize their difficulties and we need to sympathize their situation. So cultural rights of migrants or basic rights of a migrant, that should be the direction that we need to pursue. But I think the discussion on cultural diversity was directed to enlighten the general public, to raise public awareness of migrants. About 2 to 3 years ago, there are people who sought asylum in Korea from Jeju Island, and there are many conflicts revolving around the migrants. For the last 10 years, policies that we have implemented turned out to be nothing. It turned out to be not very useful or effective. So there were so many activities who supported the migrants, and they say that when policies like this continue in the Korean society, then it would be problematic. And it would not be so successful for the Korean society to become the society of a true meaning of cultural diversity. So why should we only think of migrants when we talk about the policies on cultural diversity? We need to overcome that. So now the experts and activists out on field started to pay attention to this issue. So policy for cultural diversity, I think, started to garner attention from every corner of our society. The Ministry of Culture and Sport and Tourism has been making efforts for the last 10 years, but it has not been the center of implementing the policy because the Ministry of Family and also the Ministry of Education were also leading the policies. And the rest of the ministries were led by these two main ministries. And the Ministry of Culture failed to take the lead in discussing and establishing policies on cultural diversity. So the Ministry of Culture started to take the lead.
So by having the long-lasting efforts, so we have to have a separate route to include all of that. I have spent so much time, more time than I expected. So I will go to the gist of my presentation. So the concept and the policy for uh, the diversity, cultural diversity, we can think about the minority of the culture, race, and ethnic. It is not limited to that part only. We have to check it one more time. To tell you the truth, UNESCO, for the discussion about the cultural diversity, the meaning of culture should be expanded and expanded further and have to get a transition. Back in 1982, there was a World Culture Policy meeting held in Mexico City, which is an example of what I'm saying. So this was a meeting with the head of the cultural diversity related parts. When we talk about the culture and cultural diversity, we have to establish a new definition about culture. The culture is not only limited to the art and culture and the areas when we talk about the culture, we should not only talk about culture and art, we have to expand it further. So in this declaration, not only talking about the culture and art, we also have to think about the way of life and way of work and everything that humankind has. The physical, material, physical, and knowledge and intellectual and the sentimental characteristics one society or one social group has. It means everything a society has. So, for example, this is kind of an example, but example is unlimited. That means we are talking about not a one direction, but a comprehensive direction that can include everything. So from then on, in each and every document, is that it would inherit all the spirit and remembering and reaffirm the statement and declaration that we had back in 1982. So this is one other example. Back in 1978, we had Bogota Cultural Policy Meeting, and then back in 1991, in its General Assembly, to compose and to establish a commission to talk about what it means, the culture to the humankind. So on 17th of May 1993, it launched the Monday Cult, and then 2 years later, it published a report that is our creative diversity. That means culture is the gist of our survival because this is a source of the creativism that humankind had, and that is stemming from the cultural diversity. That's why each ethnic and its nation and each country and its region, they when they're talking about their identity, they have to think about their own culture first. So to develop further of the result of this report to put it into practice, back in 1998 in Stockholm, there was an intergovernmental meeting to talk about the cultural development for development. And going further from here, we had a detailed discussion as well. And as these kind of discussions were being established and accumulated back in 2001, we had a declaration about the cultural diversity. And this declaration, when I say about this declaration, so when we talk about the cultural diversity, we also have to think about the convention and also declaration back in 2001. In 2001 declaration, it says the same meaning about the culture. Culture should be regarded as a set of distinctive spiritual, material, intellectual, and emotional features of society or a social group. And once again, it encompasses, in addition to art and literature, lifestyles, ways of living together, value system, traditions, and belief. That means it has really, really various sources inside. So when we think about this declaration, not only thinking about identity, diversity, and pluralism and cultural diversity, that means it is considered as another set of human rights. This should be enjoyed by each and every citizens in each nation. Then let me go into the convention part. So based on this declaration back in 2001, the people around the world were starting to talk about, yes, culture is beautiful, culture is really good. Everybody is applauding the meaning of culture, but we have to put it into practice. Then it should be legally binding to make it happen. But when we make it as an inconvention, that means we have to force people to do it. Then we have to clarify what people need to put into practice to make it mandatory. If we give them no boundary, they don't know what to keep and what not to keep. So back in 2000, this convention, we try to find concrete responsibility in the cultural diversity. We had the constructuring phase with FTA and other trade-related agreements. Among this kind of situation, as the direction of the international direction is going to the free trade, then everybody is talking about competition between nations. Then the first thing that we need to keep in mind to protect the cultural diversity, that is the expression of culture that each nation has. This is quite ambiguous term. Then we have to find a term that every country can understand and agree upon. So when we finally adopt the declaration or convention, that we put the English version and French version one by one, side to side, and everybody's fighting against each other to find the exact meaning of the word. So the expression about culture, we simply put it that is the cultural product. And under this current set of trade structure, maybe many countries have their own traditional cultural products and souvenirs and traditional souvenirs. Then we have to understand the exclusive and we have to understand that the cultural product should be excluded from the target of the free trade. It is to aim to the protect the cultural diversity. It is to keep the sovereignty of the nation. That's why we have to understand this kind of exceptional clause. And each country has to know how to expand their cultural expression. For the developing country, they have to build more capability to do it, and the advanced country should support them accordingly. Then we have to establish a fund in this convention, and each country can donate or contribute to it so that developing countries can use the fund to support their capability buildup. And this kind of legally binding and mandatory regulations were built in place. So based on which we talked about the convention about the cultural diversity. But for example, the US, which is the heading the free trade principle, rejected the idea because they say free trade under its principle, we cannot accept this. That's why till the end of the time, the US rejected to the idea, but many other countries accepted and agreed it. And then for the international convention, we have to have a ratification to follow suit to make all the ratified countries as the parties of the convention. And back in 2007, it put into effect. How about Korea then? Back in 2001, we actively pros on that idea and support the idea. But the problem is, even if we supported the idea, it took a little longer time for us to ratify the convention. So back in 2010, our National Assembly ratified the convention, and back in 2014 March, we established the law, the basic law on culture, and also in May we established the law on the protection of the cultural diversity, which is really strange because when we ratify international convention, it is naturally applied to the international law. But by doing the both things at the same time, we try to make the legal basis to promote this idea internally as well as internationally. And back in 2007, after making this act into law in 2014, 3 years later in 2017, we had intergovernmental meeting as we were part of the convention member. We were kind of passive for about 4 years, but back in 2017, we became the commission member of the Eastern Asia. Other countries perceive Korea should be heading the movement, but we didn't raise our hand. When I was in that intergovernment meeting, many countries participating in, and those countries keep saying that Korea is the one with the huge power internationally, so Korea should stand in front of other countries to make it happen. So finally, back in 2017, we were the commission member country and also revised the law, internal domestic law, and also were deputy chair country in the intergovernmental committee. And back in 2021, we became the chair country for the uh, cultural diversity committee. So internationally, we try to show our willingness to promote cultural diversity. So back in 2011, yes, we established a law, but we didn't actually do anything happen. But to have this willingness to put in place, we revised the law and also composed the Cultural Diversity Commission. Until we have this Cultural Diversity Commission, we had worked a lot to make it happen, but we couldn't. But it's because of other commissions under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism about the migrants, about the foreigners, and others, and the relevant ministries about the labor and others. They don't want other commission to come into being, and others also saying that we have too many committees. We have to integrate them into one rather than having another committee. So, but finally, we made a decision to have the Cultural Diversity Commission under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. Then the Prime Minister's ministerial committees, there we have the ministers to be the head of the committee. But when it is under the ministry, then the deputy ministers will be the head of the commission. That is a limitation. We do have worked a lot for this, but we have our own limitations because still, despite all the work to make a practical effort to promote the cultural diversity, still it is ambiguous. I am discussing this with other practitioners and also researchers related with the cultural diversity. Is it because of the silo that each of the administrative bureaucracy has, or it is something that what they do in their work? They really want to have distinct targets, but if we do not have distinct target or definition, we cannot do it because it is ambiguous. Even if we have worked a lot to have a concrete definition about culture, but still it is ambiguous. So about diversity in the culture and the heritage and others, yes, this is really good words. But for the local government, they don't know what to do depending on this kind of definition. In Article 3, it says it's a responsibility of the local government. It has said the local government need to protect, promote, and also develop policies to do it. But what is it? So they do everything as they did in the past. It's part of the cultural policy only. Those policymakers, they don't want to make a change. They just follow what they have done in the past. So, what I want to say in my lecture today, the cultural diversity policies in Korea, even if we have the first basic program and the plan, but we still are in our inertia. We are just keeping our practice as we did in the past. This is imperative, and we have many imperative policies and things that we need to do, but we couldn't do it yet. So the migrants and targeting migrants only in the cultural diversity, we are escaping from that a little bit by bit, because in our law is that we have to make it mandatory to have cultural diversity educations to all people in Korea. Because of that, since 2014, when we first established the law, it has been progressed somewhat, not only for the migrant people, but also all the people in the Korea, to promote cultural diversity, to break the gap or narrow the gap or break down the wall between generations, or the disabled or the non-disabled. The wall is breaking down, but the core idea in there is, in the Korean context, what needs to be stressed is not only the cultural diversity as a whole, but also internal cultural diversity. We also have to think about the internal domestic cultural diversity as well as international cultural diversity, because the ethnic or nation cannot be the unit to distinguish culture. Whole countries, each countries have many different races and many different ethnicities inside. So nation cannot be the single unit for culture. So we have increasing number of immigrants, and also ethnicity can be applied the same. We have about 7.5 million diaspora people around the world. They are living in different countries. They have their second generation, third generation, and fourth generation. By doing so, their culture, even if they are part of our ethnicity, but they have their own distinctive culture. By saying that, yes, we are sharing something in common a lot, but those Korean American fourth generation and those living currently Korean Peninsula, do they have the same culture? They do not, and they don't have to. And as we have different cultures, even if we are having the Korean ethnicity in common, in such cases, we have to respect their culture and our culture as well, and also the culture for immigrants and minority as well. And the Koreans and those Korean Americans, they're just part of the minorities we have around the world a lot. So lastly, we have to have different combinations about cultural diversity that we can have in Korea. By having that imagination, we can have right policies and we can capture the reality in the policy. For example, Korea's cultural diversity policy internationally, yes, this is the main agenda around the world, but what we are avoiding right now is a religious conflict. Thinking about the constructions, the Islam temple in Daegu, we have many controversy around this issue. This was authorized and approved, but later, due to the opposition of the residents, they just revoked it. But we have to see it from the perspective of the cultural diversity. And also, we are establishing the ordinance related with the cultural diversity, but still, those conservative, the very conservative people in the religious part, they really oppose this idea strongly. And also the sexual orientation, those sexual minorities, thinking about the globalism and from the perspective of the cultural diversity, it should be accepted, but Korean society just avoid it and try not to look into it. And all the different issues that we are having here, we have to see them from the perspective of the cultural diversity and also establish policies on that perspective. But we couldn't. That's why our policies are being fragmented, and all the major agendas in the cultural diversity is not comprehensively included in the policies. And this is the same for any other policies. We have to think about the context. And based on the context, and what need to be stressed in the policy need to be decided. And nationally, based on the same agenda, what we are doing on that agenda compared to the international way of progression. So we have to think about domestic direction and international directions, whether the stress are they the same or harmonized or not. So in that regard, our cultural diversity policies, this is not to replace migrant policies. This is to include the migrant policies. By doing so, how, under the context of the Korean society, we can respect the cultural diversity. And by doing so, how can we create new culture inside? That is actually a sense of the cultural diversity. This is mixing of different cultures to have a new culture coming into being. That is the importance of the cultural diversity. And this brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you.